Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to today's webinar, The Emerging Role of Professional Chaplains in Psychedelic Care. I'm Andrew Andresco, Project Coordinator for Transforming Chaplaincy, and we are delighted you could all join us. We'd like to thank our co-sponsor for the event, our good friends at the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. Today's webinar actually follows up on a webinar they hosted in early February titled What Chaplains Should Know About Psychedelic Medicines. You can view the recording for this that webinar and all their other previous archived webinars at their website, chaplaincyinnovation.org. Just a couple of housekeeping instructions from the top. You are listening in using your computer speaker system by default and are muted. Should you have any technical questions regarding your audio or visual, please type those into the chat box located in the platform's dashboard. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions for our presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of that same control panel. With that, I'd like to introduce Caroline Peacock, Director of Spiritual Health, Winship Cancer Institute of Emory University, Vice Chair for Wellness, Department of Hematology and Medical Oncology, Emory University School of Medicine, ACPE Certified Educator, and co-convener of our own Transforming Chaplaincy Psychedelic Care Research Network. Caroline?
Thank you so much, Andrew, and it's great to be with all of the attendees at this webinar and all of our wonderful panelists today. What we're going to do for the next hour is invite each of our panelists into some conversation about the topic of chaplaincy and psychedelic medicine, psychedelic assisted therapy. And each presenter will have some time to answer some questions. And then at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A from our questions that might be coming up in the chat. But what I'm going to do to start us off is introduce each of our presenters before we dive into their individual presentations. So our first panelist is Dr. Jamie Beachy, and she is the Assistant Core Faculty for Naropa University's Master of Divinity program. She brings 2 decades of experience in professional chaplaincy, spiritual care education, and ethics consultation to her teaching. Dr. Beachy serves as faculty co-director for Naropa's new Center for Psychedelic Studies, and she currently serves as a therapist and sub-investigator with the MAPS MDMA-assisted therapy Phase 3 study in Boulder. Dr. Beachy holds a deep interest in earth-based approaches to chaplaincy and advocates for the role of professional spiritual care in psychedelic-assisted therapy. Dr. Wael Garis is the integrative and functional medicine physician at Wisdom Tree Medicine, and he received his medical degree from Ohio State University and completed his residency at the University of Nevada. Dr. Garis also completed a fellowship in integrative medicine through the University of Arizona under the direction of Dr. Andrew Weil, and he currently serves as the co-principal investigator and study physician for the Phase 3 research trial of MDMA-assisted therapy for severe PTSD in Boulder. He enjoys being outside, hiking, skiing, and trail running, and is an avid yoga practitioner. And Rachel Peterson is a graduate student at Harvard Divinity School, where her work explores how experiences of transcendence can transfigure our understanding of self, suffering, and possible worlds. She also serves as Psychedelics and Religion Program Director for the River Styx Foundation, which is playing an active role cultivating the field of psychedelic chaplaincy. And the River Styx Foundation is also one of our sponsors for our Transforming Chaplaincy Network. In addition, Rachel is also a member of the qualitative research team for the religious professional psilocybin study conducted by NYU and Johns Hopkins. And previous to her engagement with psychedelics and chaplaincy, she spent almost a decade in environmental policy, completing extensive fieldwork in remote sites from the Arctic to the Amazon and leading diverse international teams fighting to preserve the natural world. After burning out, Rachel felt called to minister to others overwhelmed by ecological crises and to explore the role of non-ordinary states in human and non-human flourishing. So it's really exciting to have all of you three here with us. And I'm going to start with Dr. Beachy for this presentation. And just a few technical things. My audio is getting a little bit of feedback, so I will be muting and unmuting in between our conversations. So Dr. Beachy, I just want to start with a very basic question, which is the topic of our webinar here. What do you see as the role of a chaplain or spiritual health professional, and we might use those terms interchangeably? What do you see as a role of one of these persons in psychedelic care?
Thank you, Caroline. It's wonderful to be with you and to be with everyone today for this Transforming Chaplaincy event. I have a few thoughts about chaplaincy and psychedelic assisted therapy, and so I have some slides I think I'll share just to get us started with this conversation, and we'll rely on you to help me with the time, Caroline, in case I'm going over time. All right, so chaplaincy and psychedelic care is a very emergent discipline, I would say, and it's a specialization within chaplaincy. As you all likely are aware of, the chaplaincy comes from this idea of tending the chapel. And there are many different contexts for chaplaincy that have this quality of tending, I would say, and psychedelic assisted care is an emergent opportunity for chaplains to become involved in this tender work of caring for others in sacred spaces. So just a little bit about my story. I come from a professional spiritual care background in hospital settings, mostly in hospice contexts, ACPE certified as an educator, also faculty for the Master Divinity program at Naropa, and now a therapist with the MDMA assisted therapy study in Boulder with MAPS. And also important to note is that I've done a lot of personal healing work myself with psychedelic therapies, which has brought me into this this opportunity to be with others as they are also doing this healing work. So a little bit about competencies and how I understand chaplaincy. There's this saying, I think Rosalind Watts, who is a psychologist with the Synthesis Institute working with psilocybin, she said the substance is not the medicine. And I would say that these plants and mushrooms, and that they are medicines in a sense, but they're not. They need to partner with healing practitioners in order to really bring healing into these contexts. And so the medicine or the substance itself is not enough for the healing to happen. And I think that that's important for us to note as chaplains working in this field. And so these are just some of the competencies that we have some training in, and in other ways there might be some gaps for chaplains moving into this field. But presence with suffering, death and dying, non-ordinary states is really important as a competency for this work. Deep spiritual reflection and intercultural competence. Ethical accountability, which is really coming to the forefront with some situations that caused harm that are coming to light now in the psychedelic therapy field. And right use of power. Also just really good foundation of chaplaincy training, or for those who are coming from psychiatry or nursing or other disciplines, social work, having a really solid foundation in your own discipline before specializing in psychedelic assisted care would be important. And then somatic interventions are important to bring into psychedelic assisted therapy as well. And not all chaplains are trained in somatic interventions. So these are just some of the competencies. There are many others, and in in the work that Caroline and I are doing, co-chairing the research network, there's a subgroup that is looking at developing competencies specific to chaplaincy in this field. So I think I'll hold off on showing any more slides for now. But yeah, Caroline, I don't know if you have any other questions for me at this point, or if we should move on to the next presenter, but there are training opportunities for chaplains, and that I have a slide that I could share, or perhaps just send, post that on the site for people that would like a copy of the slides. But that's just a very, very quick overview of what might be happening in the field of chaplaincy with this work. And chaplains are really well placed to be contributors to the field of psychedelic care, but there are some gaps in our training. And I would say there are also, in all of these training programs, there isn't the kind of deep training in spiritual and awareness of one's own religious and theological landscape as much as chaplains might want to see. So we have this opportunity to also contribute our expertise to the field.
Well, thank you so much for all of that, Dr. Beachy. That was very, very helpful. And I think what we'll do is we will move on to Dr. Garas for some questions, but we may circle back around to, particularly in the question Q&A. So I was wondering, Dr. Garas, if you could, and I know you're calling in from a doctor's office right now, so you have the particular perspective of a physician. And I'm curious, since you are working in a dyad in this work as a physician paired with a spiritual health professional, can you talk a little bit about what it's like to be a physician working with a spiritual health professional in psychedelic assisted therapy, and what this dyad process looks like?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me in this discussion. I think I'd like to just give a little bit of maybe context because I do think that we're lumping all of psychedelics together in some way, and the study that we're doing right now is with MDMA in a specific context with PTSD, and I think that looks a lot different than, say, psilocybin for depression, ayahuasca in the jungle. I mean, every medicine is different, and I feel like the role perhaps that spiritual care or chaplaincy may provide in the MDMA setting would be somewhat different than it would be in I would say the psilocybin setting. So in MDMA assisted therapy, we're looking at we're really focused on trauma and the healing process. With that, I think that in this context, the first thing that just stands out in terms of the importance of having spiritual care in this process is that there's a lot of spiritual trauma, but there's a lot of people, several participants that we've had, that their trauma, they had trauma, maybe sexual abuse, but that was within, ritualized context or within a church context, or they're hearing something about what God was, telling them not to say anything or to question authority. At the same time, there's this abuse going on. And so having, a fluency with religious organizations, the way that religion works, I think just being able to talk about that, I think is really helpful, and to even just bring it up and bring up the and work with, because a lot of the trauma you can look at as a disconnection from self, but it is also a disconnection from the world. It's a distrust of the world, and maybe a distrust of the universe, or distrust of God, and having those conversations I think are really important in the in this healing process, and it comes up a lot more than I think MAPS acknowledges, and that I think it's really there in the basement of our culture kind of, and so that's one thing. I also I do appreciate the I think in our training programs there's for this therapy, I mean, training to be a psychedelic therapist, I think that people coming from the therapy side, I feel like they tend to maybe need to unlearn some things, and learn how to let to trust the inner healer, to not be so directive, to really allow the participant to his experience to really unfold organically without a lot of manipulation, I guess. I mean, that's not the right word, but a lot of kind of more like heavy guidance. And so I feel like the chaplains tend to already have that, coming in, just a really patient-centered, allowing just deep listening skills. And so it feels like it's not necessarily a a deficiency, coming into a therapy type of situation, where chaplains actually have, I think, some advantages. And then I think also, and this probably deals more with more the classic psychedelics, such as psilocybin and LSD, in that those experiences tend to challenge belief systems and how people make meaning in the world, and I think that realm of kind of metaphysical questioning, changing, evolution, I think there's a large role for people who are more spiritually I guess aware, competent, experienced, in terms of navigating different worldviews, different metaphysical perspectives, helping people kind of navigate that without imposing one's own, spiritual worldview. I think that chaplains really are at a big advantage in terms of that experience, and that competency.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I appreciated how you mentioned about, for some folks who are coming into some of this work in relation to some of the spiritual content, there may need to be a little bit of unlearning, in terms of, for example, if a therapist, psychotherapist of some sort might be coming into this training and maybe they're just applying their particular spiritual perspective that they were raised in, but don't have training in professional chaplaincy, they may need some unlearning in terms of what spiritual support might look like. So I'm curious, given the sort of state of current research, I know you're currently in the study where there is a co-therapist who is in the role of a chaplain. What are you aware of in terms of other research opportunities that are happening where chaplains are engaged or not engaged? What do you think would be helpful for the field right now in terms of research and future opportunities for chaplain engagement?
Well, I believe that chaplains are being, and I'm not, I guess, super connected into all the psilocybin research, but it does feel like that they are being invited to participate in that more. I think that the big people in the field like Robin Carhart-Harris and Roland Griffith, and I think they're writing and talking a lot about what is happening in the psychedelic experience, like what exactly is going on. I think Roland Griffith had, a while ago, came up with the mystical experience and and was able to develop scales and then correlate that with the degree of improvement in certain ways. And then also, I think there's a couple articles that have been coming out in terms of like how exactly do psychedelics and what exactly do they do in terms of changing people's metaphysical worldviews. And I think that there's a large opportunity for chaplains and people engaged in spiritual care to really be part of this conversation, because it is now being led by physicians and psychologists and neuroscience researchers, and there are some people like Bob Jesse in the field who have a strong influence, but I think there's a lot of opportunity as these researchers begin to or continue to unpack what this experience really is in terms of meaning making, changing in beliefs, because I mean that really is where a lot of the healing goes on, is this reframing of people's deep existence, and an article just came out the other day showing that just one psychedelic experience changed how people, increased people's belief that both living and non-living entities were conscious, so the consciousness extended to plants and rocks and mountains, and so this is research that's going on right now, and I feel like it's I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I know that there may be people who are listening in on this webinar who are chaplains at hospitals or in healthcare settings where there may be emerging research relating to psychedelics, but it might be disconnected from the spiritual care departments within those same entities. And that's exactly why we created the Transforming Chaplaincy Network on Psychedelic Assisted Care, so that people could be learning more about this work and making those connections with some of the research scientists who are engaged with this work. And the River Styx Foundation is doing all kinds of work in supporting these kinds of efforts. So I'd like to turn over to Rachel Peterson to invite you, Rachel, into conversation around this. You have a very interesting role with River Styx, and I'm curious if you'd be willing to share with us a little bit about how you found yourself in this field to begin with.
Sure. Thank you, Caroline and Jamie and Whale. And it's so humbling to see how many people are on this webinar right now and just the growing interest in this topic. So thank you, everyone in the Transforming Chaplaincy Network and Chaplaincy Innovation Lab for helping us find a space to have this important conversation. I entered into this world as a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial. So I was in the major depression study conducted by Johns Hopkins University, and my experiences were back in 2018. And I feel very fortunate to have had this very unique, rare opportunity to be in a clinical trial, because it gave me the perspective of kind of how this is developing, or how it might be developed as a medical treatment, which people plan and hope that it will become, and both seeing some of the tremendous positives of the model that's emerging, as well as some of the shortcomings of the model that's emerging, and what we might do to help address those shortcomings. And so my experiences, I don't think it'd be an overstatement to say they were among the most meaningful and impactful of my entire life. I'd spent over a decade doing everything that one does to help depression, all of the standard, therapeutic modalities, any number of mixes of medications, but nothing ever really could shift this really intransigent kind of despair, like really profound despair and hopelessness that I felt. And so in the trial, I went in completely blind and desperate. I'd never had any experiences before. This was before Michael Pollan's book had been published, and I wasn't really sure what to expect, but I was pretty desperate. I just wanted to feel better, right? And I could not have anticipated that my first experience in particular, rather than being a very simple sort of drug intervention that would tweak the neurons in my brain to make me feel better, it was just a profound encounter with a form of what felt like ultimate reality, like a force that was more real than real, that seemed to abide and exist and be holding me in a way that I'd never felt held before. And I remember coming out of the experience, and one of the researchers, asked me, "Do you still consider yourself an atheist?" And I was kind of floored, because I was like, why is this researcher asking me that question? But more so, I was floored because I didn't know how to answer anymore. And then, of course, they hand you the questionnaire to fill out, which Dr. Garris referred to, which is the mystical experience questionnaire. Like, did you transcend time and space in your experience? Did you have an experience of gnosis, of knowing, of a noetic quality? And these are questions that really have to do with the very structure and fundamental nature of reality as we experience it. And those are the kind of core questions that have been driving most of the world's religious traditions for millennia. And so it was a little disorienting, but to have this really profound experience under the guise of clinical research, and I was really grateful for it. And also it was stark that I kind of had to go out on my own and find a way to start to cultivate a spiritual practice that could make sense of that experience, that the trial wasn't really equipped with the types of people to help accompany me in that kind of spiritual meaning making process. I haven't spoken publicly about this much, but I do think it's important to name, given the moment of reckoning that I feel like we're in the psychedelic community, which is my second experience in the trial. So in the trial that I was in, it was 2 doses, 2 high doses of psilocybin. My second experience was actually quite challenging in ways that I also really struggled to make sense of, and ultimately ended up making sense of it through theological language, having to do with grace and theodicy and these kind of big questions. But it took me a really long time to find that vocabulary and that language to make sense of an experience that was quite challenging and disruptive. And so I do think that's a conversation that I haven't heard as much about, but I'm really curious about, which is, spiritual caregivers helping people with difficult experiences as much as they can help people with really profound positive experiences. And so, I really believe that, as Dr. Garris mentioned, these substances represent a whole new paradigm in mental health. Like, we're not talking about drug efficacy anymore. What we're talking about is experience efficacy. What did you experience, and how do you make meaning of what you experienced in a way that allows you to hold yourself differently, other people differently, and your life differently? And I think that spiritual caregivers at their best are well equipped to accompany people in that profound meaning making process without imposing their own kind of theological stance on others, and really help attune to the complex emotions and values and beliefs that can be changed in these experiences, as well as helping people come up with the types of ongoing practice that's required to really integrate these profound experiences into one's life. So yeah, that's a little bit about how I got into this world. And I was very struck that, as you mentioned, Caroline, even in the institution I was in, the spiritual care department wasn't part of this study. And so I just became really excited about how to build the bridge between spiritual caregivers and psychedelic researchers out in the world. I think, did we lose Caroline? Oh no.
We may have lost Caroline, but that's okay. We'll continue with our conversation. She developed some really beautiful questions for us to answer. And so we'll keep going here. I think as I can see some of the questions that you all have posted, which can also guide the rest of our conversation. One thing that we, thank you so much, Rachel. One thing that we didn't quite have time to talk about was, the way that you and I have been able to work together as a co-therapy team. There's Caroline. We're just continuing while you get back online here. So I wonder, if you'd be willing to talk about what it's been like to work. It's a loaded question. Maybe your wife asking you what it's like to work with her on a co-therapy team as a chaplain, but if you could comment on, we have had a few people that have actually had religious trauma in our MDMA work together. And if there's anything, you'd like to say about what it's like to work with a chaplain while Caroline gets back online here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's been really good. I think I mean, I've worked with a therapist before, and I've worked with another physician, and the experiences are very different. I feel like there's a just I think a more increased sensitivity in general, and I think an increased I think some of the ways that you've been able to talk with, I mean, the participants with religious trauma in a way that feels like that you understand their situation kind of from the inside, where I could not really have done that, and would have been a little bit more awkward about it, and I think that having also I mean, everybody's different in their worldviews and stuff, but it does seem like having a pretty broad, metaphysical worldview, when you're working with another physician, I mean, it seems, the scientific materialistic worldview is pretty dominant, and there doesn't seem to be, space for, the transcendent in some ways, where I feel like, us working together, that there is all that space there for that to emerge.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And sorry about the technical issues here. I think I'm back. So I missed a little bit of what Rachel, you were sharing about, but thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your experience in the study. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit from your perspective with the River Styx Foundation and where you see the field of what sometimes people are calling psychedelic chaplaincy, or psychedelics or chaplaincy within the field of psychedelic assisted therapy. What you see as needing to be the most important next steps, or where you see the field going?
Such a great question. And I also want to name that, everyone on this call has been such an important thought partner in this. Almost a year ago now, Jamie and I co-convened a kind of brain trust of people thinking about where this field is headed. So I can speak a little bit about, after having those conversations among spiritual caregivers and psychedelic researchers, some of the exciting next steps that I see emerging. I think there's a very basic first step, which we are in the process of doing even on this call today, which is, countering stigma and religious taboos and increasing the psychedelic research literacy of spiritual care educators and practitioners, really helping chaplains and spiritual caregivers get up to speed on the state of the research, as well as, educating, I think, psychedelic researchers and practitioners about the role and the value that spiritual caregivers can play. So there's sort of a kind of education and diplomacy effort, if you will, to elevate literacy about psychedelics among spiritual caregivers and literacy about spiritual caregiving among psychedelic researchers. Another exciting area that I think, several folks are leading forward, including Jamie at Naropa, Brian Anderson and Selena De Leon at GTU, and we're kind of maybe cooking up something here at Harvard Divinity School as well, which is developing core competencies and rigorous kind of training for psychedelic therapies. As we've been discussing, chaplains and spiritual caregivers are really well suited to do this work in many ways. And also there may be areas where additional training is required. So how can we think about kind of the minimum viable training that's required to really do this work with ethics and with integrity? I think there's also some issues around credentialing and endorsement of future chaplains engaged in psychedelic therapies. We've been having conversations with ACPE and other entities about how to do this. One exciting, thread of conversation is that many folks feel that in order to do psychedelic chaplaincy well, there's a need for more, interfaith or multi-religious chaplains who can be kind of like spiritual air traffic control, right? And attend to any number of people in a clinical setting who may come from different religious and spiritual backgrounds. And so there's a kind of question about credentialing and endorsement for interfaith chaplains as well. And the final thing that I would love to see is, and this has been mentioned as well, just more clinical trials incorporating spiritual caregivers into them. And I think Emory has a psilocybin trial doing this. Dana-Farber Cancer Institute has a psilocybin trial incorporating chaplains, but really kind of, building the evidence base about the value that they can add to these opportunities. So those are some of the key steps moving forward.
This question comes from the audience that really could be answered by any of you, but I'll pose it to all of you, and whoever feels called to answer, feel free to jump in. What are your suggestions for chaplains who are interested in connecting with research around psychedelic medicines at their institutions, but are unsure of where to start? Where can people find out about studies? Who can they talk to? What would be the best way to approach research scientists, for example?
Well, I think it depends on the context, really, and really it comes down to building relationships and being knowledgeable. So all of the FDA-sponsored trials are listed on a website. Perhaps someone can post that. It's clinicaltrials.gov, maybe. That's probably not exactly accurate, but you can look up all of the FDA-sponsored trials and see what's going on at your institution. And then I think being knowledgeable about psychedelic-assisted therapy, so doing your own research, joining the Chaplaincy research network that Caroline and I are co-facilitating would be a way to, be in relationship with other chaplains and doing this work. And just like we do in all of the settings where we're trying to forge new relationships and I guess advocate for the role of chaplaincy, just sitting down and having coffee and learning about what folks are doing and how we can contribute is helpful. But I think seeking training and direct experience opportunities in safe, legal settings would be important, and just building relationships through getting to know people and what they care about and what they're working on, and thinking about how chaplains can contribute to what's already happening. It's a process of really building relationships over time and having good connections to people in the field who are, doing this work and thinking about how it can be done in a good way.
Thank you for that. Another question that's coming from the audience, I'm going to kind of lump these two questions together, is what is the best way to talk about some of these substances in a way that allows people to understand them more than mere party drugs? That's one question. And another question that I might attach to this is what, if any, are the drawbacks to psychedelic assisted therapies in terms of long-term effects that people might experience? That might be a question for Dr. Garas.
All right, both of them. Yeah, I don't know about the terminology part. I mean, I think that I tend to use the word medicine. I think that sacred medicines, even. I mean, I think there's other terms like entheogens, which but I mean, I think that the general culture is really moving toward looking at these, substances as medicines. And I think that, Michael Pollan and all the articles in the New York Times, I mean, I think it is within the culture now that we're not just using these for recreation. And then I think that's a really important question. I mean, I think that we're just now, it actually really feels like a turning point in a lot of ways. We're coming out of like the maybe excessive exuberance around these treatments to a little bit more sober kind of assessment of the risks. I think that the main risk that I see, and it's kind of more my opinion. I mean, there's risks of, there's the noted risks of like, maybe small people who may tend to schizophrenia might get pushed into that, or people who are not really that stable psychologically can definitely have a lot of crisis. And so, but those risks seem to be mitigated by good screening, and then maybe some of the physical risks too, which I think are quite minimal. But I think the main, I think a lot of that is like I said, mitigated with really good screening and a good context and a good set and setting type of situation. I think even with the best set and setting and the best co-therapists, I mean, I think that the nature of these medicines is that they do open things up. They open up your psyche in ways that, if not held, navigated well, can be really destructive for many years. I mean, you can open up, you may not even realize of the trauma that went on 2 years ago, and you open up this whole can of worms with it. And if you don't have, really good support, it could not go well. Like, definitely there's risks that people just get worse, for sure. And the culture, in a way, what these medicines sometimes open up is a really countercultural way of looking at the world, like one that's not, hard materialism, and one where the plants are conscious, perhaps, and so how do you then like integrate that in a world that doesn't support that, and so that also, I think, is a risk for things, I think it rarely is it a simple solution of just 2 psilocybin sessions and then you're all good. You can go back to work and your job that wasn't that successful. There's like a lot of, it opens up a lot. So yeah.
Thank you. And I think, Rachel, you had something you wanted to add to that question as well.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you saying that, Dr. Garris. I think we're at an interesting moment where the hype has kind of created a public perception that these things are silver bullets, or that you can always necessarily control them such that the outcome is positive. So I really appreciate you naming that, yeah, there can and there has been harm done, and that's something we need to be conscious of and working against into the future. Yeah, I mean, this question of how to speak about these things such that they're beyond, party drugs, or how to open up conversations with folks who might be averse to them. I think 2 things come to mind for me. One is, and I tried to find the article, but I couldn't find it, so hopefully I can circulate it afterwards somehow. There's been some studies done on the addiction profile, or the risk of abuse of different types of drugs. And I've spoken with a lot of people who assume that, oh, if you do psilocybin once, you're going to want to do it again and again and again. I'm like, no, trust me. Like, it's a lot. You don't want to do it immediately. So there's been some interesting studies. That's one kind of thing to lead with, which is, alcohol and tobacco much more addictive than something like, LSD or psilocybin. Ketamine's a little bit different. It does have a more higher risk of abuse. But so if people are kind of concerned about addiction or abuse, there's some interesting studies out there that speak about that. Of course, anything can be used irresponsibly, but that's an interesting point. One thing we haven't talked about as well, which is, you know, an important part in this whole conversation, is the fact that many of these plant medicines have been used as religious sacraments by indigenous cultures for many years. And so it's interesting to bring to mind for people that, you know, these are things that can be held and have been held in community, and with, you know, with cosmologies behind them and with rituals behind them. And we have much to learn from those traditions and cultures as well. So they're much more than party drugs, and have been for many cultures around the world for some time.
Yes, thank you so much for speaking to that. And in relation to that, I'd like to invite Jamie to talk a little bit about training opportunities for chaplains in general. And as you're talking about training, if you could talk about the ways that Indigenous understanding, practice, Indigenous roots, Indigenous practices are being incorporated into some of the possible training programs that are out there for chaplains.
Thank you, and my apologies for the screen sharing. Hopefully you all can see us really much more clearly. So there are several training programs that have arisen, and my caution, I suppose, would be to have some deep discernment about the training program that you would choose to work with. There's a lot of entrepreneurialism going on in the field right now, and sort of a mad rush to, you know, to provide opportunities for training with the anticipation that FDA approval for MDMA and perhaps psilocybin in a few years, and also decriminalization of psilocybin in some states, including Colorado is anticipating that potential. So there's a lot of people trying to get ahead of this opportunity, and some of the folks doing that I think have really good deep intentions and good collaborations with Indigenous communities, recognizing that all of the protocols for our studies and the, you know, a lot of the wisdom that comes into psychedelic assisted therapy in the healthcare field and palliative care and other settings, and also the practices for people who are looking for spiritual expansion, and there may be, you know, the wellness field. There are people that recognize that the roots of this wisdom trace back to these indigenous traditions and have been borrowed in a lot of cases and translated into the protocols that we're drawing from. And so recognizing that relationship is an important part of integrity and having good ethical practice, and also recognizing the real risk for harm. There are some harms that are coming to light in the field, and you know, having an attentiveness to ethics and to right relationship with power. So looking for those types of considerations, as well as, you know, those that are training programs that are really interested in the public benefit and not so much in just the profit motives that are present in the field right now. So at Naropa, we have a certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies that we offer to chaplains and to psychiatrists and other healthcare clinicians, as well as therapists. And we're trying to really integrate some of those values into the training. And I would say, you know, perhaps not perfectly, but we have a deep intention, and we are a, you know, academic institution. So there are some academic institutions getting into this work, including CIIS in California and Berkeley, the GTU. Also, I know that Emory University has just launched a Center for Psychedelics and Spirituality. George Grant, who is also an ACPE educator, is one of the co-directors for that new center, and that's where Caroline is also located at Emory. So there are some places that have chaplains in positions of leadership, and are bringing in the types of values and ethos that we feel are important. And you can look for, you know, those opportunities, I suppose, and see if chaplains are on the faculty for the training programs that you're interested in. I think Rachel and Caroline, we're hoping to create kind of a list of training opportunities through the research network, and so you can look for that hopefully through the Transforming Chaplaincy Initiative. And those are just a few thoughts I have about training, but thinking deeply about integrity and what you want to be aligned with, I think would be my biggest advice for anyone looking for training opportunities, and also for experiential opportunities as well. There's a lot of really well marketed, psilocybin retreats and things, but look more deeply into what's happening there, and are they, are they embedded in good ethical practices? Do they have support from, a broader community, or are they just kind of have a lot of money to put forward really compelling, marketing strategies?
Another question that I want to direct towards you, Dr. Beachy, is related to professional chaplaincy. We are, a part of ACPE and APC as board certified chaplains, and there are certainly competencies for board certified chaplains that we adhere to. And I'm curious if this is a question that came from our audience today, if you think that there should be specific competencies for chaplains in psychedelic assisted therapy compared with other practitioners. For example, should chaplains have different competencies than say a licensed therapist or some other practitioner who's involved in the support and care in these modalities?
Yeah, so this is a robust conversation happening in the field, not just within chaplaincy, but other disciplines as well. What are the competencies for being a psychedelic care practitioner? And I would say that working within one scope is really important. So as a chaplain on the MAPS MDMA study, I'm careful to stay within my scope of practice and not to offer interventions that I'm not trained in, not trained to offer. That's true, I think, for chaplains across the different specializations where we contribute our, our expertise and our care. But specifically, I think, somatic interventions are likely to be included in preparation for psychedelic care, because psychedelic experiences often are very somatic and embodied experiences. I tend to think that chaplains could benefit from somatic training in all of the settings that we work in, but particularly in psychedelic care. I think also, having knowledge of the different treatment modalities and the particulars of each, as Dr. Garris was saying, would be really important. So, it's really best to treat psychedelic assisted care as a specialization within chaplaincy. Like if you're a chaplain and then you decide to specialize in oncology, or you specialize in ethics or in palliative care, there might be a whole set of training and competencies that you would need to become familiar with in order to move into those spaces well. And the same is really true with psychedelic assisted care. So my hope is that there will be fellowship opportunities, post CPE, post certification fellowships in psychedelic care at a place like Emory, perhaps. We're looking at internship opportunities in CPE programs through Naropa's CPE Center, so that as chaplains can receive training in CPE to, as a specialization. Perhaps those folks who've already worked in other settings are crossing over from other disciplines. But it really depends on the context. So if the care is short term, it's limited, you're with a co-therapy partner who has training that balances, the gaps in your own training, that's one situation. But to guide someone alone over a long period of time as their sole practitioner in like a palliative care setting, offering psilocybin with some, backup from a prescriber and some medical oversight, that would require deeper training than most chaplains would have. And so it's a big question. But those are some thoughts that I have that can maybe touch on some of the issues that are arising. But my other hope is that chaplains can contribute to the development of the competencies across the field. And so the more chaplains are in leadership, the more we can make sure that spiritual care-oriented competencies are included for all practitioners, like they tend to be in palliative care settings.
Thank you for that. And that's one of the functions that we're hoping that the Transforming Chaplaincy Psychedelic Care Network can be involved in terms of possibly creating competencies. As professional chaplains in the field, we want to make sure that we have our voices and perspectives in these sorts of materials that are being developed. We are nearing the end of our time, and there are so many amazing questions in the chat that we are not going to be able to get to. I'm just wondering if our panelists have any final comments or thoughts that you want to share before we end our webinar today.
Just thank you. And I'll echo, I think Jamie ended on a really beautiful note, which is the potential for professional chaplains and spiritual caregivers to actually influence the protocols and modalities that are being developed around psychedelic therapies. I know it can feel like, oh, the train left the station, how do I get on the train? It's like, no, I think there's a role for us to actually be conductors, if you will. I won't take that metaphor any further, but to actually think about how spiritual considerations can be built into these, therapeutic modalities moving forward, rather than it being an afterthought. And so we're really hoping to lead that with the Transforming Chaplaincy Network.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you as well, especially to Caroline for convening and for all of your work with the network. Thank you to the Transforming Chaplaincy, initiative for hosting us, and the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. I hope we can continue to have these conversations over time. And I know there's a lot of interest and a lot of questions, and we can only cover so much in 1 hour, but it's been wonderful to be with colleagues who are at the forefront of this emerging field, and just to be thinking together about how to do this in a good way. I think the field is really in need of our leadership, especially in relationship to ethics, and making sure that we're cautious about the potential for harm. And so I hope that that these conversations will just continue. I thank you for everyone agreeing to be here. Well, it's wonderful to be in a webinar with you. Thank you for making the time for this as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's very exciting. It's exciting to see, I guess see spirituality being brought in more explicitly into this field.
Well, thank you, everyone. And I believe Andrew, our organizer here, is making available a Word document with a number of links to networks that might be helpful for people to learn more, including our Transforming Chaplaincy Psychedelic Care Network. So please stay tuned with us, stay connected with us. And I believe we're going to be having another webinar that might be happening in June. So just look out for news of that sort. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thanks so much, everybody.